ICAHD was founded in 1997. ICAHD UK was launched in the year 2004. You know, at the time, I never imagined that we'd still be around campaigning. I thought the world would come to its senses, but my goodness, everything's just deepened, and you know, we often describe this as being a time of utter madness, but we've got to continue. And it is our next speaker who's taught me what it's about to be in a political struggle. It's long, it's hard, we mustn't, you know, give up. Our next speaker is someone who I really wanted to win the Nobel Peace Prize along with Issa Amro, but that didn't happen. Nevertheless, I hope that you'll all give the most wonderful, warm, encouraging welcome to Jeff Halper, Director of ICAHD here from Jerusalem. And so Jeff is going to speak to us about the urgency of the political moment from the settler colonial point of view. Jeff, over to you.
Okay, hello again. I'm kind of an anticlimactic speaker. I'm going to use some slides. Simon, are they, I just want to be sure that, all right, whatever. The remote works. Anyway, it's good to be back with you after 10 minutes. You know, like we keep saying all the time that ICAHD is a political organization. And so, of course, we do activist work on the ground. We relate, like I said, to the immediate situations. But we're always trying to, you know, we're always trying to look at where are we going in this struggle? How do we get out, how do we resolve it, basically? We've always sort of kept our eye on that long-term goal. So that's why we gave the name to the conference, you know, the day after, because, you know, it's understandable that we're focusing on Gaza. And it's not only understandable, it's appropriate and it's urgent. But you know, the world doesn't work in a linear way. I've even had many Palestinians say to me, we shouldn't be talking about a political solution now during a genocide. That's inappropriate. First, we have to deal with the genocide, and then we can begin to think about maybe about the future. And of course, for Palestinians to think about a future in which Israelis are a part of it is also painful. I mean, imagine trying to imagine your future with the people that are committing genocide on you. Nevertheless, you know, the world doesn't work in a linear way. Trump, Netanyahu, all the politicians, they're multitasking. And things are coming down the pipeline, like the Abraham Accords, for example, and other things that we'll talk about, that we have to relate to. We don't determine the agenda. We don't determine the timeline. They do. And whether or not we feel overwhelmed or we feel it's appropriate or timely or whatever, we have to be part of the political process. And I'm really concerned that we're going to be overwhelmed by events. That by the time we get past Gaza, and we're not past Gaza in any way. The ceasefire is not a ceasefire. The genocide continues, so you know we can't leave that. But at the same time, these other things are happening. And if we're not able to sort of link our actions to the actual political events that are happening, we're going to be overtaken by events. Things are going to happen, and we're going to find ourselves, again, in a reactive situation, and fairly powerless to change things. So that's what I'd like to do today, is sort of deal with where are we in the struggle right now in terms of Palestine, and to focus on the day after. Now, let me see if this remote works. Our first slides. Okay. It does. Okay. From? Okay, all right, okay. So, where I want to start from, we've talked about this a little bit. Many of you are new. Many of you haven't, I haven't been all over the UK, so you all haven't heard me speak, about the settler colonial analysis. And now we have to start, before we get into what the solution is and what our programs are and our activities, we have to understand what we're talking about. You know, this whole issue has been misanalyzed all these years. And that's why partly why we're in the mess that we're in today. You know, analysis is really important. Many of you are of a certain age, like me, in which, you know, we know the medical world pretty well by now. And you know how important diagnosis is. I mean, if you have a pain in your chest, you know, and you go to the hospital, there's 100 medicines on the shelves that the doctor can just give you. But the pain could be an anti-acid attack because you had something bad for dinner, or it could be a stroke. So the diagnosis is pretty important. The treatment flows from what the diagnosis is. What happens if you misdiagnose? What happens if you say, take a Tums, and it is a stroke? You know, and that's exactly what's happening to the Palestinians. They're the victims of a misanalysis, and therefore any solution that governments bring, a two-state solution or Trump's plan of normalizing, is going to be against the Palestinians. We trap them in a lose-lose situation. So where I want to start is, this is not a conflict. We all use the word conflict. The Israeli-Palestine conflict. We use it. The Palestinians use it. The media uses it. It's called a conflict. That's the word we use. But it's not a conflict. That's a misdiagnosis. It's not a conflict. It's a settler colonial situation. A conflict is between two sides, right? I mean, two or more sides get into a fight, a dispute about something, and they have a conflict. How do you resolve a conflict? The sides get together, they negotiate, they compromise, and they come up with something that's sort of acceptable to both sides, vaguely. That's sort of the way it works. It doesn't resolve the conflict usually, but it manages it for a period of time until it breaks out again. But there's no sides here. Settler colonialism is unilateral. When the Zionists were planning their invasion of Palestine, settler colonialism is when a settler population from abroad comes to take over someone else's country, right? The Zionists coming from Eastern Europe never asked the Palestinians, can we come to your country and take it over? Palestinians were never informed that this was happening. In fact, it took them about 20 years, the Palestinians, to really understand that they were being invaded. You know, because Jews had lived there for millennia, and here a few Jews are coming from Europe, and they're buying some land here and there, they're settling here and there. They weren't plugged into the Zionist organization back in Europe that was funding this. They didn't plug into Herzl's political plans. They didn't understand Zionism as a settler colonial movement. So the invasion took place in the very beginning, certainly, in a very kind of a quiet way, so that there was no conflict. Palestinians were never in a conflict with Jews. And when the Jews began their invasion of Palestine, the Palestinians didn't take it in the wrong way. They welcomed the Jews in many cases until they begin to understand what's really going on. So that it's unilateral. So the problem with sides then is this, that colonialism, all colonialism, settler or classical colonialism, is illegal. There are laws, international laws, against colonialism, against apartheid, against genocide, and the UN Charter guarantees the right of self-determination of peoples like Palestinians, right? So it's illegal, it's immoral, and unjust, any type of colonialism. Well, the minute you make the Zionists a side to a conflict, you're raising them to a level of legitimacy. Now, from simply being invaders that come into a country in an illegal, unjust way to take it over in a brutal, violent way, because settler colonialism has to be violent. You don't take over someone's country peacefully. By making them a side in a conflict, now they're legitimate. Great. Now we're a side that the Palestinians are forced to deal with. And what does it do to the Palestinians? Palestinians are a peaceful people, living in their own country, normally, with their culture, their daily life, whatever. All of a sudden, they find themselves a side. If the Zionists are raised to being a side, to legitimacy, the Palestinians are reduced from being a people that there's no reason why they have to justify why they're in the country, why they have to defend their right to be there, why they have to compromise. I mean, what are we expecting the Palestinians to compromise about? How much of their country the colonists can take, which is 78% according to the two-state idea. How many refugees the colonists deem, are willing to accept back. By making Palestinians a side, you weaken them, you reduce their presence, you delegitimize their actual patrimony over the country, and you force them to compromise and get into negotiations they shouldn't have to get into. And of course, conflict implies that the two sides are somehow symmetrical, that there's real negotiations. Well, we know that's not the case. One side is a state, recognized by the international community, including your government, a member of the United Nations, with, as Kamala Harris always reminds us, with the right to defend itself, even to defend itself against the very territory that it's occupying, the people that it's colonizing. And as a state, it has a right to an army and the right to use force. And what are the Palestinians? They're not really a side. They're non-state actors that have no state, that have no right to, not only to an army, but really they have no right to resist. Now, in international law, they do have a right to resist. Even armed struggle is legitimate and legal in international law. But states control the language. They control the framing. And so it's very easy, especially if you're in a conflict scenario, to turn the resistance, the legitimate resistance of the Palestinian people into terrorism. So they're not even allowed to resist their own colonization. They can't even resist their own genocide, because in doing that, they're a non-state actor that has no legitimate access to arms, fighting against a state that has a right to defend its borders and so on. That's the whole distorted reality that this concept of conflict brings in. Instead, we should be talking about, we should name what this is. This is an indigenous struggle against settler colonialism. And struggle is a much better term than conflict. Conflict traps them into this structure of inequality in which they have to lose. There's no way the Palestinians can ever prevail in terms of their rights in this conflict kind of a scenario. Struggle legitimizes their resistance. You see, once you go to a settler colonial analysis, it releases a whole new logic, a whole new language, right? Resistance doesn't make sense in a conflict kind of a situation, because the whole idea is you're supposed to be a side that's negotiating. And if you're being violent, first of all, you're not cooperating, and then you blame the non-state actor for that. And second of all, you're legitimizing the state using violence against you. And that all becomes, and terrorism makes sense to people. But if you adopt the settler colonial framing and language, Now we're talking about resistance. I mean, people can certainly understand that. Of course people resist colonization. So the minute we begin to shift to that kind of an analysis, we're opening up a new possibility for people to understand what we're talking about. And eventually, because now we've got a better diagnosis, now we're able to lead to the treatment, to the solution that's appropriate, that we'll talk about in a second. All right, forget it. Simon? Now, just so we understand, one of the interesting things is that settler colonialism, which is a mouthful, somehow escaped the academic, jargony little universe, and it's become a part of the discourse. You hear all the time people talking about settler colonialism. But most people aren't academics. It's a very important concept. So we tend to use it kind of as an accusation. Zionism instead of colonialism, okay, we've said that, now let's get on to stop the occupation, stop God. So let me unpack it just for a couple minutes because it's so important, and I want us to begin to adopt it as our framing. We have to reframe this. Settler colonialism all over the world tends to follow a similar pattern because it's a similar enterprise, coming in and taking over someone else's country. In terms of Palestine and Zionism, let's say you could break it down into 4 stages. The first stage, I keep pointing at this, I got 3 screens here. The first stage is the invasion and the initial settlement of the country, right? So here, to the left side of the map, you see a map of Palestine, a normal country, not exactly a land without a people. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of villages and towns and even cities, with the whole infrastructure. It had its economy, it's had its culture. It was a part of Greater Syria. It was a part of the Ottoman Empire, but Palestine was a coherent cultural area. And then you begin to see on the map on the right the initial settlement, the settlement that happens before 1947. Now, Zionism wasn't able to really settle as much as it wanted to because it was constrained first by the Ottoman Empire and then by the British during the Mandate. But nevertheless, even so they bought about 6% of what became Israel. That about 6% was purchased by the Zionist organization. And you see the settlement plan and the way the settlements, in other words, settlement wasn't just settlement, that you come in and just go live anywhere. It was very strategic. They settled where they wanted the borders to be. So the borders that became Israel were determined by settlements 20 or 30 years before there was the possibility of a state. Certain junctions, certain control of water, of land resources, dividing Palestinian population centers. There's all kinds of considerations. But what's interesting when you look at the map is that you already see by the 1920s and 30s the outline of the West Bank, the outline of what became Israel and the West Bank. So this was the intent, and the settlement certainly had a logic to it. The second phase, Simon, the second phase is Judaization, where you actually take over the country. Now, the Zionists were able to do that in 1948, after the British left. And as long as you guys were there, they were constrained. The minute the partition plan was announced, and then in May of 48 the British left, then Zionism, with all its strength and all its intents, was able to, to come out of the box, out of the closet, and actually Judaize the country. And these are maps that we all know. The partition plan of 1948. And again, the Jews are newcomers to the country, but got 56% of the land from the UN. And the UN at that time, of course, was basically a European club. The entire global South and the Arab world certainly weren't represented in the UN. and the couple Arab countries that were opposed to the partition plan. But the Jews got 56% of Palestine, and the Palestinians only got 42% in that gray area, with another 2% that was Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The UN had no authority to partition Palestine, but that partition took place. And then, of course, in 1948, Israel then conquered half the territory that had been allocated to the Palestinians. The Galilee, much of the Negev, the whole center part, you can see the contrast of the two maps. So here we get, by the end of the war, to the map that we know today. The armistice line, that we call the Green Line, and Israel on 78% of Palestine now, and the Palestinian, Jordan took over part, Egypt took over Gaza, but the 22% of Palestine that remained became the occupied territories in 1967. Now, normalization is the way settler colonialism ends. It doesn't end through a decisive victory. It ends by settling, taking the land, creating massive facts on the ground, and then that's normalized. That becomes simply internalized. It's a part of the way we see the country. It's accepted. And to show you the power of normalization, in 1988, the PLO gave up its anti-colonial struggle and shifted to the two-state solution. They shifted from the settler colonial struggle to a conflict model, a conflict process, conflict resolution, negotiations leading into Oslo, which completely destroyed them, as we well know. But when the negotiations began, it began from the Palestine that you see in the second map that emerges after the Nakba. In other words, the partition resolution of 1947 never expired. It's still valid today. But between 1948 and 1988, or 1993, when the Oslo process begins, this map, the second map of Israel, on 78% of the country became accepted. It became normalized. That was Israel. The green line, until today, is seen as the border. It's not a border. It's a temporary armistice line. But it's been normalized as if it's a border. So when Arafat and the PLO come to negotiate with Israel under the Oslo, they didn't begin with the partition plan of 1947. Arafat could have said, all right, let's begin negotiating. We have 42% of the country, you have 56%, let's start with that. But instead, even Arafat and the PLO internalized the normalization that had gone on, in which half the land allocated to them, that's still allocated to them, is Israel. So they began the negotiations with 22%, which meant that in Oslo, 78% of Palestine is outside of the equation. It's not to be negotiated. We're not negotiating Israel, we're negotiating the occupied territory. So 78% is taken out. Now we're talking about the 22% that remains, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Well, the 22% then becomes 100% of what we're negotiating. Well, if you want 100%, you're not being reasonable. Nobody goes into a negotiation and gets 100%. So now we're deciding on how much of the 22% can the Palestinians get. So you can see both the power of normalization and how this idea of conflict, structures things in a way that works against the colonized people. So you have that, and then in 1967, of course, Israel takes the rest of the West Bank, and East Jerusalem is the next, and Gaza. And then you get the matrix of control, where Israel really begins the settlement of the West Bank. And this process is called Judaization. It's a term that's super important, and we almost never use it. The process of settlement and transforming an Arab country into a Jewish country, transforming Palestine into Israel, is a process of Judaization. That should be a term we're using all the time, because that's the term that describes the very purpose of Zionism. This is the essence of it. And the fact that we don't use that term, maybe it sounds vaguely anti-Semitic, I don't know. But it's a term that the Zionist movement always used, and the Israeli government uses it officially. We are Judaizing the Galilee. We're Judaizing Judea and Samaria. We're Judaizing Jerusalem. It's a term that's used, and without that term, you can't grasp what the very purpose and what the process is of taking over Palestine. So the major control began that, and the last map is sort of the final image of Palestine, that Israel is aiming for, in which Israel Judaizes 85% of Palestine, including all the borders. Now, it can't accept the 5 million Palestinians that live in the occupied territory, because obviously, if you give 5 million, if you annex that or absorb it, and you give them citizenship, it's not a Jewish state anymore. So from a settler colonial Judaization point of view, you see here you begin to get the logic. It becomes obvious if you're in the right paradigm. From that point of view, there has to be apartheid. Apartheid is the only possible conclusion of this, because you want to Judaize and take over all of Palestine, but you don't want the 5 million Palestinians of the occupied territory. And so you have to, it's the same logic as South Africa, really. You have to lock them into this Bantustan on islands on about 15% of the country, areas A and B, and whatever's left of Gaza, and that becomes the two-state solution. And that's the problem also with this concept of two states. Now we have France and Saudi Arabia with this initiative in the UN. 160 or so countries have now recognized the state of Palestine, but without borders. So the state of Palestine could just as well be this Bantustan in orange as a two-state solution. But even the two-state solution, a Palestinian state, means a defeat in terms of settler colonialism. So that's really where we're going. Simon, the next slide. And even worse, this is a map put out by Smotrich. Bezalel Smotrich, who's the Deputy Minister of Defense in Israel, and is de facto, besides being the finance minister, is de facto the governor of the West Bank, put out this map. The Ministry of Defense put out this map, where in fact Palestinians are all confined to the major cities, and everything else, including areas A and B, become a part of Israel. Okay. Now, this isn't a secret. I mean, Israel certainly doesn't use the term settler colonialism, but it's not a secret that this is happening. And again, the way it wins is through normalization. So here's Netanyahu on the podium of the General Assembly 2 weeks before October 7th, right? Showing the map of the new Middle East, because Saudi Arabia was right on the cusp of entering into the Abraham Accords, right? So this is the heartland of the Sunni Arab world in green, and it's maybe hard to see from where you are, but there's Israel, a blue Israel up there, but there's no two states here. There's no Palestinian presence whatsoever. It's one blue area, that's Greater Israel, without Palestinians, normalized with the Arab world. And this is the new Middle East. Now, the fact that this is 2 weeks, I don't know if there's a relationship, but the fact that this is 2 weeks before could explain the timing of the military operation of October 7th of Hamas. Because in fact, what it did do was delay, at least, I don't think it's ended, but it's certainly delayed by a few years, Saudi Arabia coming in. It's making it very hard for Saudi Arabia to come into the Abraham Accords because of public opinion in Saudi Arabia and in the rest of the Arab world. And so, this kind of resistance can be very effective politically. Now, now you have the Trump plan. And the Trump plan, as you can see on the map here, means that in the Abraham Accords, and again, it's based on normalization. It's not based on an agreement. So it's a completely different process than negotiations. Normalization is not negotiations. It's not the Oslo process. It's a deal. Remember Trump's deal of the century? It's a deal between states, the United States, Israel, and the Arab governments. They get into a deal about normalizing relations with Israel. And so in the Trump plan, all of Israel and all the settlements are to be normalized. Now, it doesn't mean, now if it was negotiations with the Palestinians, they wouldn't accept that, of course. And if Israel wanted to incorporate the settlements into it, it would have to annex them. Well, even Trump is against annexation, right? Because annexation is in your face. The Arab governments have enough problem dealing with Israel because of public opinion back home. Even though they're autocratic states, they still have public opinion. They have enough trouble without Israel actually saying, all right, we're annexing this territory. We're annexing the settlements. What are you going to do about it? It's in their face. But you don't have to do that with normalization. Normalization simply recognizes and accepts the facts on the ground. There's no negotiations. Palestinians don't have to agree. Israel doesn't have to say we're annexing. That's where Smotrich is actually pissing off Netanyahu. And all this talk about annexation, the Knesset passed a resolution about annexation, has pissed off Trump. Because why are you raising these elements of discord and argument and visibility to a process that could just happen quietly? And so this is the danger of normalization. And the danger of normalization is whatever facts on the ground are there on the day the normalization agreement is signed is normalized. And that explains why the settler attacks on Palestinians, why al-Khair, why all the communities we're working with are under such attack today. Why the ethnic cleansing has gotten so intense. Because we're in a last-minute land grab. The Abraham Accords could happen in a couple months. It's coming down the pipeline. So there's a timeline. Everything Israel can grab until the day it's signed becomes normalized. And that's the final stage. In other words, we talked about 4 stages. The first stage was invasion and initial settlement. The second stage was Judaization. The fourth stage and final stage is normalization. What about the third stage? Well, the third stage is important. The third stage is pacification. Because as we said, no settler, no colonial project can happen without the resistance of the indigenous population. It has to generate resistance all the time. And so for normalization to happen, you have to pacify the population. You have to break the resistance once and for all. Because as long as there's even a hint of resistance, you can't normalize. Just think of the concept of normalization. Normalization means it's normal. If it's normal, nobody's objecting to it, right? There's no resistance. Otherwise, it's not normal. Normal demands that it be quiet, that it be accepted, that it be, that there's no argument about it. Well, Palestinian resistance prevents that from happening. And that explains, from my point of view, Gaza. What's happening in Gaza and in the northern part of the West Bank. Like Linda was saying, the Gazification of certainly the resistance in the refugee camps in the north of the West Bank. because Saudi Arabia and the Arab governments cannot really complete the Abraham Accords as long as there's any hint of Palestinian resistance, because public opinion in their countries won't allow, it's still alive, you see. And so in Gaza, you're breaking the resistance. But not only that, the Israeli army said, look, we won a year and a half ago. There's no reason for us to be in Gaza. We eliminated Hamas as a effective military organization a year and a half ago. Netanyahu talks about total victory, and everybody laughs at him. You never get total victory. What, are you going to get the last Palestinian in Gaza who identifies with Hamas, and you have to kill him before you get to the end of the war? And everybody, but Netanyahu is not a dumb guy, and he gets the settler colonial process. For total victory means the absolute silencing of any resistance. In other words, if you do get to a point where one sniper gets up and shoots an Israeli soldier, like happened the other day, that cost the lives of about 100 Palestinians, that one sniper is enough resistance that you haven't pacified. You haven't quieted it down. You can't move on. And that's where we are now. We're in stage 3, which is this pacification process, because you've got to get to a place of industrial quiet. There has to be 2, 3, 4, 6 months of quiet before you go back to the Abraham Accords, and Saudi Arabia and the Arab government can rejoin that. You know, that's the process. So a precondition, a prerequisite for normalization is pacification. So you see it in Gaza, certainly. The destruction of Gaza, you know, way beyond, you know, and pacification, of course, applies to the people, not only to the resistance. Israel's message to the Palestinians is this: you have 3 choices. You can submit, because when Netanyahu talks about, and Trump and these peace agreements talk about reforming the Palestinian Authority, that's what they mean, is submission. If you won't remember, but when Netanyahu was in the White House with Trump together, you know, and this whole peace thing, you know, was coming out, he talked very explicitly about reforming the Palestinian Authority. That's written into the agreement. What does that mean? He was very forthright about it, Netanyahu. It means the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Not only that, as a legitimate Jewish state, that they recognize the settlements, that they stop going to the ICJ and the ICC, that they stop teaching their kids anti-Israel, anti-Zionist stuff, and that they submit, that they can live in their little islands in the Bantustan, but they have to be recognized and accept the fact that they are a minority in a Jewish country. That's what reforming the Palestinian Authority means. So pacification goes beyond the military. The whole people has to be pacified. Otherwise, you can't get to normalization. So the first thing Israel says is, if you submit, we'll stop. And then we'll normalize, and settler colonialism wins. Zionism wins. Or leave. Get out. Either leave voluntarily. Israel says to the Palestinians, you're in a prison, but the back door is open. You can go through Jordan, wherever you want to go, Egypt, go somewhere else, or you'll be forced out. And that's, of course, this whole plan that is still being actively pursued by Israel of third countries, like South Sudan, for example. We're not talking about the UK or Germany. South Sudan taking, 2 million Palestinians, or Indonesia, or Albania, or Libya. So this idea of leave, get out, is very much pursued. And then the third option is you either submit, you get out, or you die. And that's the message that you have in this picture. You die. And the fact that it's genocide, that it goes far beyond, a military fight against Hamas and tunnels and all of that, is because this is a war of peoples, war against Palestinian people. The people have to be subdued in order to get on to normalization. And of course, another one, this is happening in the West Bank as well. This is Jenin refugee camp. We don't really notice it very much, but there's 40,000 displaced Palestinians in the West Bank that have been the victims of conventional military attacks like Gaza. Okay. And of course, in the West Bank, again, the house demolitions continue, the violence of the settlers, and so on. So this is sort of where we are in the whole settler colonial process. We're getting towards the end. We're getting to a place where, you know, Israel's going to win or something else is going to happen. I mean, this is why I'm saying, you know, we have to multitask. We can't be overtaken by events. This whole process, you know, we're in between stage 3 and 4 of the settler colonial process, and the Palestinian resistance, you know, is getting weaker. I mean, there is a chance. You know, there's a sign outside that Simon mentioned, you know, where Martin Luther King said the arc of history tends towards justice, or bends towards justice. Well, Jesse Jackson said after that, he said, yeah, but we've got to bend it. Somebody's got to bend it. It doesn't bend by itself. And we have to be part of that agency because there is a possibility. You know, we always like happy endings. Justice prevails, all this sort of stuff. But that's not inevitable. The bad guys win sometimes. And Israeli settler colonialism, supported by your government, by almost all governments, and certainly by Trump, you know, is close to being completed. And the Palestinians, they're finding it, I think, more and more difficult to resist. So then, you know, you get to this is, you know, sort of where we are. There's 3 political processes happening. One is the Trump plan of normalization. The second is the 2-state plan of Europe, because Europe has always been excluded from the political process, but now they're finding a way to integrate Trump's plan with the French, Saudi, you know, recognition of a Palestinian state. So they both basically are against the Palestinians and are for an apartheid situation. And then the third process hasn't really begun yet, and that's a Palestinian process of what do the Palestinians want. You know, their own Palestinian government has been co-opted by Israel. You know, the Palestinian Authority is a collaborationist regime, so their own leadership it's like de Klerk like Mandela works for de Klerk. So they have no access to any political agency that can actually express their program of liberation, their aspirations of liberation. And what Arafat and Abu Mazen dismantled basically the PLO. So there is no political vehicle. And so it's part of our job, and that's why I said in my first little presentation that we have to help give the Palestinian people the space to come together and really formulate a plan of their own, because they have no other option. There's no one else representing them. And if they can't do it, if they can't insert their voice and agency into this process, they lose, almost by default. And so you have a situation here where settler colonialism could win if the Judaization of Palestine takes place, and that's the Abraham Accords to this two-state thing, and then it's normalized. And again, this could happen soon. This isn't like a long-term scenario, and an apartheid regime emerges. Or we could defeat it. ICAHD is a part of a political movement. You know, we're in a struggle. And you can't be in a struggle if you think you're going to lose. Or you're fatalistic. Well, the powers are too big, and all we can do is protest. No, we're in a struggle, but if we're in a struggle, we have to be strategic. We have to have a program. We have to be organized. And there has to be a real partnership between the Palestinian people who are very weak at this point in this struggle, that are even having difficulty expressing their aspirations, and all of us that are mobilized for them. The mobilization is there. It's great. It's wonderful, but it's lacking that direction, that political focus that only the Palestinians in Palestine can give. And if they're not able to do that, and then if they're not able, even if they do, because, I mean, there is the beginning of a one democratic state movement emerging, if they're not able to insert that into your activities, because your activities here tend to be generated by local things and not correlated with the Palestinians, then the struggle becomes that much more difficult. But if we have, settler colonialism can be defeated, and it's been defeated many times. South Africa is one of the examples. Let's not get into the economics of it, but in a political sense, you need then to summon power. We're at a place where the Palestinians have to begin to summon power, and we're a part of that. You're all a part of that, which means resistance. The resistance is really crucial, and they've been resisting now for more than a century, right? But that resistance, you know, it's in this day where you have AI-generated targeting systems and the surveillance that Israel has, and the fact that you can just cover with drones and spy satellites every single inch of land, you know where everybody is. Resistance becomes really very difficult, especially in Palestine. You don't have mountains to hide in and jungles. It's not Vietnam, you see. So the resistance has to be able to pass on the strength that it's accumulated to a political force that then translates it into a political program. We don't have that yet. And then that political program has to be adopted by a liberation organization. And then that connects up to what all of you are doing and gives direction to the mobilization. So one democratic state seems to be, logically, the treatment coming from the diagnosis of settler colonialism. The only solution to colonialism is decolonization and the creating of something completely new. I'll finish in a minute. I promise, Simon. All right, I won't get into this. Let's go on. So, ICAHD is ICAHD is a founding member of a Palestinian-led organization called the One Democratic State Campaign. We've formulated a 10-point political program. You can find it on the website called onestatecampaign.org. It's fairly straightforward. You know, there's no tricks. It's not a confederation. Now what's happening is, because everybody sees the two-state solution is disappearing, I would say the liberal Zionists, the left Zionists, in a way, are scrambling. How do we save a Jewish, if not state, a Jewish sovereignty or whatever, if we don't have a two-state solution? How do we, and we don't want apartheid. We don't want the Abraham Accords. What do we do? Well, now you're getting all kinds of ideas of confederations and federations and cantons, all kinds of, that are really just trying to salvage the Zionist cause, basically. The one-state solution is very straightforward. First of all, you decolonize. You dismantle all the structures of control and domination that Zionism has placed over the Palestinians. You dismantle that, and then this becomes the country, from the river to the sea. So unlike your politicians, between the river and the sea is actually a liberatory concept. It's not an anti-Semitic concept, but it's true. There is no more Israel. There's one constitutional democracy, one country, one parliament, one electoral system, one legal system, a constitution. basically a normal kind of a democracy. That's really what's being proposed. Equal rights for everyone. Israeli Jews remain. They remain in their homes. On the contrary, it's even better if they can remain in the settlements, because the settlements aren't settlements anymore. They don't control anything. They can be integrated. And once Ma'ale Adumim is integrated, it becomes a nice place to live. I mean, the houses aren't the enemy. It loses, that's the dismantling of the structures of domination. You don't have Jewish communities controlling movement anymore. Once in this kind of a state. And then in this kind of a state, the refugees can return, and you have then land redistribution, compensation, reparations, the reintegration into society. That can't happen even in the best of the two-state solutions. There simply isn't the space for that. And there's all the individual rights. Go back for one second. The individual rights. And then there is a fly in the ointment. I'm not going to get into it now. And that is this issue of collective rights. I'll just mention, because, I'll bring you into, there's all kinds of issues that have to be resolved within Palestine, Israel as well, that you're not so much a part of, but just to kind of let you in. There's two concepts of the one democratic state. One is the vast majority of Palestinians want it to be a Palestinian state. For Palestine, they say, look, liberation is liberation. Liberation means we get our country back, we get our national rights restored, we get our land back, right? Jews can stay in the country. Every Palestinian movement. There's nobody that's in favor of expelling the Israeli Jews or whatever. The Jews remain with equal rights, but they're not recognized as a national group. It's a Palestinian state. There's a Palestinian national entity, and the Jews are equal citizens, but they're not Israeli Jews. They're not accepted as a national group. They can be an ethnic group, a religious group. The Palestinian view, which makes sense, is, an Israeli national identity was invented, constructed when the settler colonial movement began. If you expect us Palestinians to recognize Israeli Jews as a national group like us, you're rewarding settler colonialism. We're not going to do that. And therefore, we're talking about a Palestinian democracy of equal rights, but nevertheless, it expresses the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. Our group, the One Democratic State Campaign, is a minority group from that point of view. We recognize the justice of that, the logic of it, and so on, but what we say is, look, there are called colonial legacies. We're not going back to Palestine as it was in 1948 or 1917 or whatever. And the fact that Israel has been a sovereign state for 80 years, has led to the fact that Israelis are a national group. Whether they should be or shouldn't be, they become a national group. And you're not going, I'm speaking as an anthropologist now, groups, you can't dictate to groups what their identities are, and certainly you can't reduce a national group to an ethnic group. So that even though the Palestinian case makes sense, a Palestinian state that suppresses an Israeli national identity, plants the seeds of intercommunal conflict. Because now, just like Israel, Israel suppresses the Palestinian identity by calling them Israeli Arabs. That colonial reversal could easily happen in a Palestinian state. So this is the big issue that remains, and that is this going to be one democratic Palestinian state of equal rights for everyone, or is this going to be one democratic civil state that belongs to all its citizens, and then within that state, Palestinian national culture, there's a cultural self-determination. You could be Palestinian and have your universities and your literature and your religion, everything about Palestine, and Israeli as well, as long as it's within the framework of the civil state. No one has, in a sense, dismantled, Chris can correct me on this, Afrikaners still see themselves as a national group. The Zulu still see themselves as a nation. And they were against, of course, the unitary state that I'm talking about. But nevertheless, that unitary civil society emerged in South Africa, and it's fine as long as the Zulu and the Afrikaners, conduct their national lives within the framework of the civil society. That's fine. We're not going to impose anything on them. All right, I'm going to conclude. Well, let me just okay, go on. I want to. So in all our work, all of us, there's the political is missing, and that's why ICAHD, I think, plays this unique role. Maybe it's also why we're not well funded. We don't have the masses of membership and so on, because we're trying to do this infrastructure work of building political programs and organizing. It's not so public, and it's certainly not humanitarian. In my view, I tried to map out the Palestinian movement worldwide. And there's, the formal political structures, like the political parties and the PLO in Palestine are dysfunctional. They don't really work. So there's no vibrant political life because the Palestinian civil society isn't able to organize and express itself. Then you have all kinds of activist organizations here. The PNC and all the local groups, and there's religious groups. The churches are involved, and Amnesty, of course, human rights well, no, that's another side of this. I'm trying to read my own. You see, and all the local groups. There's a lot of international organization, and even on the ground as well, but without a direction. Certainly without a direction from Palestinians. So it's protests, it's bringing the issues out, you're doing great work, and so on, but it's lacking a political component. Where are we going? What's the program? What are we advocating for? And then you have a very developed human rights international law section, and that's Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, and in Palestine, Al-Haq and Adalah, B'Tselem in Israel, and so on. That's I just came with Linda from the Gaza Tribunal, as you heard. That's developed. But that's not political in a sense. It's human rights, and it's trying to support human rights, but their agenda is not to help formulate a political program. B'Tselem opens all of its meetings by saying we're human rights, we're not political. So, you see, and then you've got the academics. There's a lot of Palestinian academics and others writing, volumes about Palestine. And there's conferences, and but it doesn't it's analysis, but it doesn't translate into a political program. So what I'm saying is, for all of that exists, the political is missing. There's no center, there's no coordinating committee, there's no organized way in which all of you can be in contact with the Palestinian civil society. And that's the area that ICAHD is involved with. And maybe it's too specialized, maybe it's too quiet, or whatever, to become a mass organization like the PSC is. But it's really important work that's being done. Okay, Simon, I think the last. Okay, so that's sort of what I have to say, and hopefully what I've done today is not only give the idea of where we could be going, but the logic of it, and it's so important that we do this paradigm shift from a conflict language to an anti-colonial language based on settler colonialism.